Welcome everyone to the third session of the series, Stealing the Earth, the Conquering of Indigenous Peoples, the Role of Christianity, and What Can Bring About Justice. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. We are over 100 years old. We're a faith-based policy and organizing network. And our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a progressive United Methodist movement, energizing people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. We are so excited to be co-hosting this webinar series with our partners, the Native American International Caucus, NAIC, and United Methodists for Kairos Response, UMKR. Now, our session today, our third session, is entitled Pervasive and Self Perpetuating, the continuous falsifying of narratives. We will be discussing how dehumanization and violence are used to perpetuate the doctrine of discovery and how that continues today. A few announcements concerning our call today. We are recording this webinar, and that webinar recording will be shared in the coming days. I will post a link in the chat. If you've been with us on calls before, you should be familiar with that link, and you can also find it on our YouTube channel as well. As you have questions, we invite you to type them in the chat. You don't have to wait till we get to the Q&A. For your questions to be shared, you can share them at any time. And closed captioning is automatically generated. So do expect to see some spelling errors and other errors as the computer is doing this automatically. Today we are pleased to have Reverend Dr. Daniel Hawk, Lorenda Morgan, and Leon Su as our speakers today. Our first speaker is Reverend Dr. Daniel Hawk, professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Ashland Theological Seminary, a clergy member of the East Ohio Conference, and the author of Joshua in 3D, a commentary on biblical conquest and manifest destiny, as well as shorter works that explore the parallels between the biblical and American conquest narratives. And Dan is going to help bring everything in context and share a little update on where we are in the doctrine of discovery. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Bridget. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We've been talking about the doctrine of discovery against the backdrop of three intersecting understandings. So first, in the original sense, the doctrine of discovery refers to a body of international law generated by European rulers at the outset of the colonial era, the purpose of which was to sort out who had the right to claim and seize newly discovered lands. That body of law was based on a series of 15th century papal bulls that declared that Christian monarchs, originally Spain and Portugal, had the right to occupy and seize newly discovered land, provided that they evangelized the population. So the idea was basically, if you discover it, you own it. Secondly, the doctrine of discovery was cited in 1823 by the United States Supreme Court as the legal basis for claims to the land that the United States owned or would acquire as it spread westward. The Marshall Court ruled that the laws of the United States are based on British antecedents, and those antecedents, as they touched on the ownership of land, rested on the doctrine of discovery. So in essence, the court basically ruled that the United States is the rightful owner of the land it possessed or will possess because its laws say that it is. And finally, we can think of the doctrine of discovery as an ideology that justifies land seizure on the basis of entitlement. And that sense of entitlement can be expressed in secular terms, for example, by the argument that the land that European white settlers were seizing was empty, or that the indigenous peoples were not putting the land to good use, or that bestowing civilization was more than ample compensation for taking indigenous land. Or it can be put in transcendent terms, for example, by claims that God gave the land to white settlers, or as in the case of the United States, by appeal to a manifest destiny by which the nation has been called to spread freedom and civilization around the globe. And that's about it.
Thank you, Dan. Our next speaker, our first speaker today is Lorenda Morgan. Lorenda is an enrolled member of the Cheyenne Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma and is also part of the Toy, Missouri tribe. She attended Carter Seminary Indian Boarding School and is a graduate of the University of Oklahoma with a BA in social sciences and a master's in human relations. Since then, she has held a wide variety of offices within her tribe and Oklahoma state government, and is currently the governmental affairs officer for the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. She's also been involved in electoral politics on the local and national level, was tribal liaison for the Oklahoma Democratic Party, and a 2016 Democratic candidate for Oklahoma House District 96. She was also Oklahoma campaign co-chair for Bernie Sanders in 2020. She regularly speaks on the topics of intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, cultural competency, foster care recruitment, Indian Child Welfare Act compliance, barriers to Native voting, Native political engagement, Native voters, tribal state relations, women in gaming empowerment tools, missing and murdered Indigenous women, epidemic and domestic violence in Indian country. Lorenda Morgan is a United Methodist who also participates in traditional Cheyenne ceremonies. She's been married for 27 years, has 2 children and a dog, and is a proud Cheyenne descendant of Shell women, a survivor of the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. We are so grateful to welcome Lorenda Morgan.
Thank you and welcome everybody. I'm just so honored to be here and happy that I was asked to come and speak today on the topic. And while there's so many topics that we could cover under this umbrella of information, I'm going to specifically talk about the missing and murdered Indigenous people epidemic that's going across not only Oklahoma, but the United States. As far as how it's linked to the Doctrine of Discovery is throughout history, Native peoples have been victimized by the Doctrine of Discovery with the taking of our lands, and then also the treatment of our Indigenous people, and the dehumanization of our human lives and our existence as human beings. And so I believe that with what has happened historically, it has given society a kind of example of how they have been able to treat our Indigenous people here in the United States. And one of those things has and I'm going to specifically talk about domestic violence in Indian country, which is one of the main factors to the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples epidemic. And so how I have been involved is my cousin, her name is Ida Beard. In 2015, she was also a Cheyenne Arapaho tribal member. She went missing from here in Oklahoma in June of 2015. And from that time, the investigators and the law enforcement were unable to find any evidence about her missing persons case. And it was believed that due to her being a Native American and that, other factors came into play to her missing, such as, the law enforcement said, well, maybe she was involved in drug trafficking, sex trafficking. Maybe she just left and, like she would just leave her children and her family behind. So a lot of assumptions were made about her life because she was a Native American woman. And so her case wasn't taken seriously. So in 2018, I started working with a member of the Oklahoma State Legislature to work on some ways that we could address not only cases like Ida Beard's, which was sitting on, in the police files and was not being appropriately investigated. We worked on some ways, we did a lot of research, and we found out that not only within Oklahoma, but within the United States, that many of the Indigenous people's cases have had similar outcomes to where they just were not taken seriously. I believe that, a lot of this has to do with also kind of the dehumanization. It's another way that our Indigenous people have been dehumanized, not only in life, but also, if they had been murdered or if they've gone missing, they're still being dehumanized because their cases are not being appropriately investigated. So, and with what I do in my work, and also as a family member, I utilized my skills and my education, my experience to help create Ida's Law, which then created a missing and murdered Indigenous peoples liaison within the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation to help kind of work on these cases. And what the law enacts is that liaison office to work with tribal nations, work with tribal families, work with all levels of law enforcement, including federal, FBI, tribal law enforcement, which is Bureau of Indian Affairs, city, state, county, highway patrol, and to kind of coordinate and help them and provide training to them about some of the jurisdictional issues that come up when Native Americans or Indigenous people go missing. Because a lot of times we find out that, law enforcement may think just because someone is an Indigenous person or Native American that, somebody else is going to investigate their case, and that's not true. And also there's a lot of other issues. For example, if a Indigenous person goes missing and they live on a reservation, but they go missing, in a city or a county off the reservation, that provides some jurisdictional issues, or vice versa. If the person lives in the city limits and they're a tribal member, and they, were missing on the reservation, then that also provides some barriers and some jurisdictional issues about who and how the case is going to be investigated and by whom. So there's a lot of, barriers and obstacles in a lot of these cases. And then there's the simple cases that, are just cut and dry and they still haven't been investigated. And we just kind of think, in my mind, that it gives Native Americans, Indigenous people, the idea that, we're being treated as a lesser people, even in situations as this. So I had worked from 2018, 2019 with some representatives here in Oklahoma, worked on the creation of the law, worked on getting it through the Oklahoma State Legislature, all the way to the bill signing, and then the implementation of the law which took effect on November 1st here in Oklahoma on November 1st, 2021. So we have an agent, OSBI agent, who is now tasked and with doing this job in this position here in Oklahoma to address these issues. The missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis has been around for a long time, but it just began to gain recognition within the last probably 5, 6, 7 years due to advocates and activists. And a lot of times, you know, the media would overlook Indigenous people's cases. But now, you know, we've seen kind of a turnaround where major media outlets have covered a lot of these cases. And even as recently as People magazine putting out a large article spread about missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. So I think part of it is getting the general public educated about, you know, what's going on, and that in turn has affected, you know, some of the government agencies, the law enforcement agencies, to, you know, do better and to take action and to do the steps necessary to investigate a lot of these cases. And there has been federal legislation done by Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland. She was then a congresswoman from New Mexico, as well as she was helped by Oklahoma Congressman Mark Wayne Mullins. So they have done some missing and murdered Indigenous peoples legislation at the federal level that you know, got media attention and has helped educate a lot of people about this epidemic and this crisis. So that is what I have been working on, and you know, you can look it up on the internet. You can Google it, missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. There's a lot of resources. There's pages and pages of information if you want more information, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know it's a lot of information. It's just, but I know I'm on a time limit, so.
Thank you so much, Lorenda. And as you have questions, be sure to type them in the chat as you're thinking of questions. Our next speaker is Leon Su. Leon is of Hawaiian and Chinese ancestry and hails from the island of Hawaii. While he is well known as a recording artist with the group Leon and Malia, he also plays a vital role in the movement to restore the Hawaiian kingdom as a sovereign nation. To that end, he is currently serving as its Minister of Foreign Affairs with the goal of restoring diplomatic relations with other nations. He also serves as a director of the Koana Foundation. In 2016, Mr. Su was awarded the Knight's Grand Cross of the Royal Order of Kamehameha, was nominated for the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize, and in June 2017, he received the Degree of Consecration, Diploma, and Gold Medal, UN Peacemaker Sergio Vieira del Mello Award from the International Parliament. He is co-author of the book Modus Vivendi Situation of West Papai and the editor of 2 seminal works, Perpetuated in Righteousness and Hawaii, the Fake State, a Nation in Captivity. Leon Su is striving to promote understanding, cooperation, creativity, and goodwill. As a follower of Jesus, he is committed to glorifying God in all he does. He is one of the founders of Aloha Ke Akua Ministries, which encourages Native peoples to seek God through the gifts God has deposited in their own culture. He also served on the steering committees of many Indigenous religious organizations and is an elder in an Indigenous church called Koakana Oka Aloha. We welcome Leon Su.
Mahalo for that introduction. Oh, let's see. Looks like, okay, mahalo for that introduction. Aloha, aloha ke akua. Aloha I mai o ko a e maluhia hoi ke akua e ko makua a he kahaku Yesu a me ka uhane he molele. Greetings to everybody. I'm really honored to be here today to speak about our nation and about our people. And I've been on a number of webinars regarding the Doctrine of Discovery, so have covered quite a bit. But what I wanted to do today was kind of talk about what specifically happened in the Hawaiian Islands with the Hawaiians, and in contrast or in similarity to the Native Americans, and why our situations are similar in some cases, but very different in other cases. So the Hawaiian Islands was a sovereign independent country. It was officially recognized by the family of nations, by actually initially Great Britain and France, in a proclamation in 1843, which absolutely described the Hawaiian Islands as a sovereign independent country. And it was the first nation that was not connected to a European nation that was recognized as a part of the family of nations. In other words, we were part of the club of the Doctrine of Discovery nations. And we were part of the Discoverers Club. And this is since 1843. Prior to that, we had already really established ourselves as an independent nation. But the official recognition and the official documentation of Hawaii as a sovereign nation came in 1843. So 2 weekends ago, we celebrated the 178th anniversary of Hawaiian independence. Now, Hawaii is very different from, like I said, the Native American nations, because we were never considered a part of the United States, or were never considered an inferior nation to the Doctrine of Discovery members. We were never conquered. We were never claimed by any other country. And so we basically became a member of the family of nations, as I said. And the way we did this was because Hawaii actually had converted very, very early to Christianity, to the point where after the landing of the first missionaries in 1820 in the Hawaiian Islands, the conversion happened very rapidly, so that by the mid-1830s, 16 years later, Hawaii was 91% Christian. And this was at that point the highest rate of Christianity in any country per capita, and actually grew later to 96% by the 1850s. So Hawaii was the most Christian nation on earth, and at the same time, it became the most literate nation on earth, because our monarch saw that in order for Hawaiians to learn and to actually understand the Bible, to understand Christianity, they needed to read. And so edicts had been put out for everybody to read. And so Hawaii became the most literate nation on earth as well. Started publishing our histories and our culture and all that in Hawaiian publications. Hawaii is one of the most documented in writing nations in the world, because we started writing very early and have voluminous works on Hawaiians and Hawaiian culture, Hawaiian society, and on, of course, geopolitical issues. So Hawaii was a very progressive nation. It became a world trading center. And Hawaii then had diplomatic relations with over 40 nations around the world, had diplomatic legations, embassies, and consulates in 137 cities around the world. So Hawaii was not considered an indigenous nation or indigenous people. It was considered a sovereign nation. And that is the difference between our situation and the situation of Native Americans and of Native peoples all over the world. We're considered not an indigenous people, although we have indigenous peoples living here, but we actually are considered a sovereign nation. In 1893, the United States conspired to overthrow our kingdom because actually they conspired earlier, but they executed in 1893 because the United States at that time had how would you say, expanded the concept of Doctrine of Discovery and personalized it to the United States, and they called it Manifest Destiny. So not only did they have the blessing of God to go and expand into the world, they actually had a calling from God, they felt, manifest destiny, that God ordered them to expand their influence out into the world. So in order to expand into the Pacific, they cooked up this manifest destiny mandate from God. And so in order to get into the Pacific, they needed the Hawaiian Islands as a naval base to expand expand the United States influence into the Pacific. So in 1893, they had an opportunity because there were a group of disgruntled American and foreign owners of sugar companies and of other businesses in Hawaii, disgruntled because they wanted to increase their profits by becoming annexed to the United States. The feeling was that if Hawaii were to be part of the United States, then there wouldn't be foreign tariffs applied to goods coming from Hawaii to the United States, particularly sugar. And so the sugar planters and their cohorts in the business community got together and they cooked up a scheme to invite the United States to annex the Hawaiian Islands. But in order to do so, they had to overthrow the government. And that's what they did. In 1893, a group of sugar planters concocted an excuse to seize the government. They conducted a coup d'etat, but they couldn't do it on their own. What they needed was the United States' help to do this. So the United States minister in Hawaii, who would be considered today the ambassador to the Hawaiian Islands, agreed to assist the insurrectionists to take over the Hawaiian Islands by landing troops, American troops, in Honolulu to threaten the Queen and to threaten the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And so that's what they did. On January 17th, 1893, United States landed troops and set up and aimed their cannons and whatever weapons that they brought at the Iolani Palace where the Queen resided. The Queen, recognizing that this was an unlawful act. By the way, the kings and queens of Hawaii were extremely knowledgeable about international affairs, and they had studied, of course, quite a bit in their schools, in their training that they received in their schools. They studied a lot about international law, biblical law, canonical law, and all kinds of things about what constituted law and what constituted international relations. The law of nations was heavily studied at that time. So every one of the kings and queens who took the throne were very well versed in international law and in monarchical law. So the Queen at that time, Liliuokalani, 1893, with the threat of the United States military, decided to take the diplomatic route, and that is she yielded her authority at that time to the United States, not to the insurrectionists, but to the United States, in order to conduct, begin a formal investigation as to the conditions and the situation of what happened on January 17th. So she stepped down from the authority, but she did not dissolve the government. She simply stepped down and turned the issue over into the hands of the President of the United States to investigate and to come out with a conclusion that this was an international wrongful act. And that's what happened. President Cleveland became president about a month and a half after the incident of the overthrow, and he immediately stopped any actions toward annexation at the United States Senate. Excuse me. And he basically ordered an investigation to happen, which took place for several months. He sent an investigator from the United States. And the conclusion was that the United States participated in an international wrongful act, in an act of aggression against a friendly nation, which was prohibited by our treaties with the United States as well as international law. And so he announced to the Congress of the United States that the United States acted wrongfully, and if it weren't for the United States actions, the coup d'etat would not have taken place. And he did not recognize the legality did not recognize the insurrectionists or the government that they had set up, the provisional government for the Hawaiian Kingdom, did not recognize them as a lawful government, nor as a de jure government. So basically, he said it was an illegal government. And so he said that the United States had the obligation, international obligation, to honor its treaties and to honor its international obligations, to return to restore the Hawaiian Kingdom to its proper governance. The United States did not do so. They simply stalled until President Cleveland was no longer in office. And then a President McKinley came into place, and he was one of the foremost proponents of manifest destiny. So he cooked up schemes in ways that they could actually take Hawaii without having to go through the formal process of a treaty of annexation or treaty of cession or any of that type. So basically, he and Congress cooked up an illegal way to seize the Hawaiian Islands. They had the cover of the Spanish-American War to conduct this. So now Hawaii became vital to U.S. interests in the Spanish-American War in the Philippines and in Guam, because they needed to ship through Hawaii, they needed to ship troops and their naval forces there. So that is what happened. Hawaii got kind of swallowed up in the Spanish-American War. And after the war, the United States basically claimed that Hawaii was part of the spoils of the Spanish-American War. So during after the Spanish-American War, the United States gained Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, the Philippines, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and then they snuck Hawaii into the mix in that, so that they considered Hawaii a territory, and they passed organic laws to make Hawaii a territory and to govern the Hawaiian Islands. So that's what happened with Hawaii. We didn't know about this because of an intensive indoctrination program that occurred in our schools. So for 60 years, we were convinced that Hawaii was part of the United States, and that the Hawaiian Kingdom was a thing of the past, that we had invited the United States to take over because we were incompetent to run our own country, even though Hawaii had been one of the most progressive nations on earth at the time. So we found out in the 70s what actually happened, because the truth had been hidden from us. And as we began to dig, we began to realize that the Hawaiian Islands is still a sovereign nation, that whatever actions the United States had taken were illegal, therefore could not have been lawful in any way. Therefore, their claim to the Hawaiian Islands is an unlawful claim. The problem is that we had been under the United States for over 100 years by this time, or by the 1890s, we had been under the United States for 100 years. And it was difficult to dislodge the perception of the world about the status of the Hawaiian Kingdom or the Hawaiian Islands as a sovereign nation. And so this is what I've been working on for the last 25 years. That is to inform the world about our situation and to talk about the obligation that not only the United States has, but the world has through organs such as the United Nations, the obligation to make right the wrong that had taken place, to actually free a sovereign nation from an illegal 125-year occupation by the United States. So that's what our situation is, and that's where I am right now. Now, we're talking about the vestiges of colonialism. So what happened with the Hawaiian Kingdom and the Hawaiian people was that we were denationalized. That is, our identity was stolen. We were told we were Americans, and not only that, as Indigenous peoples, we were marginalized. Our lands were taken. We were dispossessed of our lands, and it was given over into to the United States to oversee and to manage. And that is where we are right now. The management of our lands and our resources and all that is with the state of Hawaii, which is a puppet government installed by the United States, and ultimately under the jurisdiction of the United States. Unlike the Native Americans, we are not an indigenous tribe, although the United States has tried mightily in the last 20 years to subsume us into a tribal identity so that they could, in negotiations with a tribal government, they could then complete the theft of our nation by coming to some kind of a settlement and agreement. So we have been striving to, one, avoid becoming subsumed as an American Indian nation or a Hawaiian tribal nation. And we at the same time have been pushing to reinstate and to reaffirm our existence as a sovereign independent nation of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Thank you very much. Well, actually, maybe I should say a little bit more, and that is the consequences that we are facing today is that Hawaiians, as I said, have been marginalized, and we suffer many of the same treatment that the Native Americans have suffered. That is being marginalized, being impoverished, having our lands and our resources taken over by other people and sold off to foreigners and to other people in a very illegal way, and yet our voices have been very, very much quieted because of the overwhelming amount of aliens that live in our country, including the United States, people from the United States, and people from all over the world who have come and actually contributed to the occupation of our nation by overwhelming the local population. So Hawaiians, and when we look at Hawaiians as far as an ethnic group, Hawaiians constitute about 20% of the population of Hawaiian Islands. The rest are all foreigners, but the rest are not all US citizens. I mean, there are many that of foreign birth that actually identify with the Hawaiian Kingdom because they have been here for years. The Hawaiian Kingdom was not an ethnically identified nation. It was a nation that actually included anybody who was in the borders of the Hawaiian Kingdom at the time, in the 1890s, and who pledged allegiance to the Hawaiian Kingdom and lived under the laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom. You could become naturalized into the Hawaiian Kingdom. So many of the immigrants that had come in to work in the sugar plantations, the Chinese, the Japanese, and later the Koreans and Filipinos, actually became naturalized into the Hawaiian Kingdom. And so they constitute, in 1893, our country was predominantly Hawaiian, ethnically Hawaiian, but there were anybody who lived in Hawaii who became Hawaiian nationals were considered part of our nation. So the issue is not one of an indigenous nation being overrun, but one of a sovereign nation being overrun and occupied by a foreign country, the United States.
Thank you, Leon. We are going to enter into our Q&A time now. So we will have a great opportunity to be in conversation with our speakers. I invite folks to continue to type in your questions in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. We might not be able to get to everybody, but we'll squeeze in as many as we can. The first question is for both Leon and Lorenda. How have Native Hawaiians and Native Americans seen commonalities or solidarity with each other and differences? We'll start with Lorenda.
I believe that within the Indigenous peoples, I guess, categorization, when you're talking about Indigenous peoples, it not only, for us as Indigenous people, it's not only Native Americans or people in the United States. We consider Indigenous peoples, as far as our Indigenous people, to be people from Canada, Mexico, the Hawaiians, Alaskans. So I believe that, you know, the separation that has been put on the, you know, as far as categorizing the Indigenous people was not put out there by us. So, thank you.
Yes, so the similarities that we share is that back in the 1970s, when movements like the American Indian movement and others started to rise, Hawaii was also very much a part of that, and was part of the group that approached the United Nations to seek a voice at the United Nations for Indigenous peoples, which ultimately later ended up to be the permanent form of Indigenous peoples, which is a meeting that's held every year at the United Nations in New York. But the beginning of it was in Geneva at the United Nations human rights bodies in Geneva. And so Hawaii participated very much in the talks that led to the creation of the United Nations mechanisms to address Indigenous issues. So you have the permanent forum on Indigenous issues, the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and several other bodies that the United Nations have used, the CERD and others like that, to address Indigenous issues. So we participated very heavily in that. It was much later in the 90s that we began to see that our issue, besides being one of Indigenous peoples, being maltreated by an occupation or a state. Besides that, we saw that the issue for us was more one of a national identity rather than an Indigenous identity. So we still heavily participate in the mechanisms for Indigenous peoples, but we also work quite a bit in the area of decolonization and these other issues about freeing countries for independence. We work quite a bit with the Pacific Island nations because, of course, we're all Indigenous, and many of them, of course, most of them have become independent nations. So they have become very strongly supportive of our issues for both indigeneity, or the rights of Indigenous peoples, as well as for the rights of sovereignty. And then, of course, I personally work quite a bit with other nations that have been subsumed in the area of decolonization. So West Papua is one of those areas. So the one you mentioned, I was author of a book, and that was the Modus Vivendi of West Papua. And that is one of the areas I'm working in. I work with the Kashmiri in Pakistan, or between India and Pakistan, and numerous other countries that both identify as indigenous as well as independent states, or the right for independence.
Yes, I also believe that you know, education is one of the main tools that we need to and you know, I'm just thinking about what you're saying about, you know, how indigenous people we kind of, from our view, our perspective, you know, we're a solidified group. And when you're talking about some of the other nations, I remember when I was a student at OU, there were foreign students like from Pakistan and Bangladesh that were there. And one of them was my tutor for algebra. And he wanted to know what country I was from. He was like, "What country are you from?" And I was like, I told him that I was, you know, a Native American Indigenous person. And he didn't know, you know, coming as an international student, he didn't know that Native Americans were still alive. And, you know, he said he studied about him in the history books, but he had never met a real Native American person that was from a tribe, like the Cheyenne, Arapaho tribes. And I think that, you know, I told him, I was like, well, we're indigenous. And that was one of the things I told him. I said, and you're indigenous in my view, you know. And he was like, I am, you know. And I was like, yeah, you're an indigenous person to where you know, to your land, and just like I'm an indigenous person to my land. And so, like, when someone asks a question about, you know, that was posed to us about how we feel if we're divided or unified, in my mind, from my perspective, we are a unified people, that because we have had the same historical traumas, the same dehumanization happened to all of our people by the, you know, by colonialism. So
Thank you. These next couple of questions are for Lorenda. The first question is, what term do you prefer to use, First Americans or Native Americans? Is the term preference dependent on whom one is speaking? And the next question is, will you address the man camps and sex trafficking at the Canadian borders? Has the presence of casinos increased the missing and murdered Indigenous women persons crisis?
You know, as far as labels, I think that for us as tribal people, there have been so many labels across, you know, the decades. We, as myself, I call myself a tribal member, tribal citizen. And I usually refer to myself as a Cheyenne, Arapaho, Oto, you know, tribal citizen. As far as, you know, the labels of First American or Indigenous or Native American, even Indian, because within the government, you know, you have, they still use the term Indian. It's still used as far as Indian Health Service, you know, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That term is still active, and I don't think that, as far as we kind of know that it's used for government terms, U.S. government terms. As far as Native American, I don't have an issue with it. I don't have an issue with Indigenous. First American, I've kind of had some hesitancy about it, because obviously we were not the first Americans. We were Indigenous people. We were tribal nations. We were tribal people. We were not even given citizenship until, I believe it was 1924. So we were not even the first American citizens. But I see the reason why they would call us first Americans, because we were here first, but we were actually not the first Americans citizens. And even, you know, our voting rights, we weren't allowed to vote till, gosh, some of the last states didn't pass it until I believe it was the 1950s. So that term, it's a new term that has been, you know, we have in Oklahoma City a First Americans Museum, which holds all of our tribal nations, historical facts and information and artifacts, and it's called First Americans Museum. And, you know, even my daughter, she was like, gosh, aren't we the last Americans? I mean, you know, so that term, it's kind of still, you know, kind of, I guess, I'm still trying to absorb that. So, and then about the man camps, what was the question about it
was if you can address the man camps and sex trafficking at the Canadian borders, and has the presence of casinos increased any of the missing, murdered Indigenous peoples crisis?
Yes, in North Dakota and the bordering states, that mainly from what I've known of, it's been North Dakota, because they had a lot of, I guess, oil pipeline industry work going on there. And there have been some cases of women going missing, or, you know, crimes happening due to those man camps. But I don't believe that it's the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous people happen specifically at casinos or at man camps more often than anywhere else. And the reason why I say that is because in Oklahoma, there has been a lot of cases. In other states, there has been a lot of cases of missing, murdered Indigenous people where there were not man camps. And a lot of these missing persons cases or murders that happen don't happen at casinos. They happen right around where the person lives, possibly their home, or, you know, within a certain amount of miles from, you know, where they travel. And I think that, you know, there's also the factor of domestic violence, where a lot of times the murders happen. There's a certain percentage of murders that happen with domestic partners. So, and then there's also the cases of, you know, where these crimes have occurred, or the cases have occurred with people they totally don't know. I wouldn't specifically say that, you know, man camps or casinos are the issue.
Thank you, Brenda. A couple of questions for Leon. What kind of discussions are taking place in Hawaii? How strong is the movement in Hawaii to push for its independence and to regain its status as a sovereign nation? And the second one being, how can sovereign nations reclaim true sovereignty? Can continental nations learn from the island nations' sovereignty movements and create a potential movement of movements?
All right, thank you. That's an extensive question. You know, when the United Nations was formed, it was in 1946, and most of the world was colonial. So the United Nations decided, besides their primary mission, which is to end any disputes in peaceful manner, so to promote peace, the second one was to decolonize the world. And so they created a list of countries to be decolonized, and the various countries that were colonial countries submitted these different countries to be onto this list. There were about 100 countries that were submitted to the list of countries to be decolonized. And the United Nations set about to start to encourage the decolonization of these countries. So all of Africa, all of Southeast Asia, all of Oceania, except for Hawaii, Well, actually, Hawaii was included in it too. But these were all countries to be decolonized. So fast forward to when the United Nations started, there were 51 countries that were in the initial body of the United Nations. Today, there are 193. So the process of decolonization has succeeded quite well in that most of the countries that were on that list have now become independent countries. So they were given the opportunity to vote at some time. The people of those countries were given the opportunity to vote to become independent or to remain tied to the administrative country or to become integrated into the administrative country. So in our situation, the United States decided to integrate Hawaii and Alaska into the countries that the United States had submitted were Hawaii, Alaska, Guam, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, and American Samoa. There are 6 countries the United Nations submitted for decolonization in 1946. But in 1959, as it was becoming they became nervous about the fact that Hawaii and Alaska might be decolonized. And so they cooked up a scheme to make it appear like a decolonization process had taken place, but to rig it in such a way that we wouldn't become independent. And so they created 2 referenda, one in Alaska and one in Hawaii, in which they announced that they were going to have a vote, but the vote was for statehood. There was nothing else mentioned in that vote. And of course, the votes for statehood were heavily promoted. Native peoples were excluded from voting. In fact, only US citizens in those places could vote, and including the US military stationed in those places. And so obviously the vote would come out in favor of statehood. And that's what the United States took and announced and presented a report to the United Nations that Hawaii and Alaska had both, the people of Hawaii and Alaska had consented to become a state of the United States. And that's how Hawaii and Alaska were removed from that list. The other 4 countries are still on that list. So Guam, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, and American Samoa are still on the list, and they are going through the process right now of decolonization. Now, the United Nations started out with about 100 countries on the decolonization list. Today, there are 17 countries. So they have been pretty successful, but it actually had been frozen at 16 since 1985. And so it's been 30 years since anybody was decolonized from that list. And then in 2013, French Polynesia was added to the list. And so they became 17. And since then, nothing has happened. Now they are going through the motions. They are having elections, they're having referenda in these different places. In fact, this month, New Caledonia is having a referendum. Last November, Puerto Rico voted for statehood. So they're going on, but Hawaii and Alaska were never given the opportunity to choose for ourselves, nor were we educated. So Lorenda, you talked about education. This is a major problem. If you don't know there's a problem, then what? Right. There's nothing that people do about it. But here's the other side of it. If you know there's a problem, what are you going to do about it? Yes. And so I want to refer back to 1993 when the United States apologized for stealing our country. They issued a formal apology from the United States Congress signed by President Clinton that the United States never lawfully acquired the Hawaiian Islands. And then they called at the end of it for reconciliation. But they also, at the very end, they put a statement that says, this document does not constitute a settlement of wrongdoing. So they talk about reconciliation. So here we are 28 years later, and there has been no movement toward reconciliation of the fact that they admitted that they stole Hawaii. And in fact, every time we challenged them on that, they said, oh, no, we're in Hawaii lawfully, even though they have a document that says they're not. And they refer back to these Supreme Court cases back in the 1830s and all that basically give them permission to take countries under the Doctrine of Discovery, and to treat Native peoples as chattel and as possessions. And so there are many Supreme Court cases in the United States that basically continue to relegate Native peoples into the category of being inferior and need to be ruled by the white people. And so and those cases are still on the books, and they're still being used, although they're socially and the culture has grown quite a bit to recognize that there were wrongdoings, but legally they're still not owning up to it. They issue apologies, but the apologies are empty. In Canada, for instance, of course, they issued a really beautiful apology for the wrongdoing of government and all that, but they're still, they're still now discovering or revealing that yes, residential schools happened, etc., and now they're trying to deal with that, and of course the same as the boarding schools in North America. So none of the actual wrongs that had been committed are being addressed in a meaningful way. It's all talk, So these apologies are issued. They form committees, they study the issues and all that, but nobody comes up with actions that they're going to be taken. And so the Methodist Federation for Social Action, I want to urge you to really hold these countries accountable for take action. We've had all the apologies we need. We've proven all of these things. We can prove it in courts if they allow us in the courts to prove them, but there is no action being taken. And particularly, and so this is where one of my pet gripes is about the church. And I'm talking about the Christian church in Hawaii, because as I mentioned before, the Hawaiians were a predominant, not overwhelmingly Christian nation. And as such, the Christian churches in our nation conspired against our people and sided with the American takeover of our islands, as has happened in North America and other places where the Christian church, and all the way back to the Doctrine of Discovery, becomes a tool of the colonizer, and a very powerful tool at that, to subdue the people and to bring them all into obeisance to the colonizers. So if we're talking about actions to be taken, we need to reverse. And the way we start is with the churches that are discussing these issues, to stop discussing what happened and all that, but start to talk about what can we do to reverse the effects of colonialism. Now, there's one other thing I want to say. So 1985 was the last country to actually be decolonized through the decolonization system. But so in 1990, the United Nations very graciously decided to issue a declaration for the eradication of colonialism. So they said 1990 to 99 would be the first decade, would be a decade for the eradication of colonialism. And then nothing happened. And then a couple of apologies came out, things like that. So in the year 2000, they issued another proclamation for declaration for the eradication of colonialism. Nothing happened. 2010, they issued another third decade for the eradication of colonialism, and nothing has happened. And just this year, they issued, or actually last year, 2020, they issued the fourth declaration of the decade for eradication of colonialism. And so far, nothing has happened. So issue as many declarations as you want, apologies as you want, unless we start to see action, that it is meaningless. And not only that, it compounds the problem, because we now understand, you know what the problem is. What are you going to do about it? And to be answered by, we're not going to do anything about it. We're just going to declare another decade for the eradication of colonialism, or we're going to declare another apology and talk about it ad infinitum, but never do anything about it. So this is where I believe that we really, as the church, needs to address. It needs to address, what is the church going to do? Not what the United States is going to do, or the United Nations, or Canada, or any of these colonial countries, not what they're going to do, but what is the church that is embedded in every community in the United States? What is that church going to do to reverse the effects of colonialism? Yeah.
I also want to point out something that I forgot to mention. Somebody had asked about data and statistics in the chat about the data and statistics for missing and murdered Indigenous people. And the statistics of the number of missing and murdered Indigenous people is really unknown. And the reason why is because I had working on the legislation. I tried to get numbers and statistics from the FBI, and I worked alongside the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. And it's, I had mentioned, it's because of the way that the federal government categorizes Native Americans or tribal people. It's because, and I think it goes back to the fact that tribal governments and tribes and people in members of tribes, we are not a racial classification. We are considered a political entity. And therefore, like when the FBI has statistics of murders, crimes, robberies, all these things, homicides, they have a racial classification for everyone. They do not have a racial classification for Native Americans. Native Americans are put in a classification of Asians, Alaskans, Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and other, which is us, other. So there's no clear number that can identify actually how many cases of Native Americans have gone missing, because we don't have our own racial classification that they can put the numbers into. So that's why they say there's really the numbers and the data and statistics, they're just really estimations. That's what we got from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. And also, there's a lot of other factors of underreporting, misreporting, non-reporting from some of the small town police departments may not actually report their case to, a state or national database. So that's something I also wanted to say, and that, it kind of links into what Leon was saying about, the US government has their, I guess what they're going to do, and it's going to be hard for them to change or to rectify what has been done, or to try and make changes, because it's obviously it's the US government, and they are not going to, probably change our classification or tribal nations into, actually identifying us as human beings and a race anytime soon. And so, I agree with what he said about, the churches need to make changes, but I am optimistic because, and maybe it's just me, And it's because I see, even with my kids being in school, they're treated a lot different than I was treated. I mean, even though there are some instances of racial prejudice, and I believe that comes from the dehumanization, just from people's older generations' ideas of what Indians are, Native Americans are, or people of color. They tend to, look at us as inferior. Whereas now, those generations are going to die off. And hopefully with the way that the culture is diversifying here in the United States, there's only 12,000 Cheyenne Arapahoes on the earth, and so with all the other tribes, they're intermarrying as with other cultures and other races of people. They're intermarrying. Everybody is very culturally diverse now. And so I think that any one race is having somebody that is a full anything, or is that's going to be diluted with generations to come. And so people are going to be more accepting of other people, and they're going to recognize, people as everyone's a human being. Everybody matters. Everybody, is more equal than they are now, but that's going to be generations to come, because I think the view and the perspective of these older generations that have been passed down, the superior mindset, and I don't want to just say that it's a white superior mindset, because even here recently in Oklahoma, there was a African American man, a radio personality, within the last week that was fired from his job because he was on air with his co-host dehumanizing Native American people here in Oklahoma. So I don't believe that it's just one certain race. I think it's just an ideal, that maybe other races have, even minorities have. Like I've said before, Native Americans, Indigenous people are the minority of the minorities. And I'm hoping that in the future that will change, especially for my children and my grandchildren. And so, but I agree with what Leon says. It's one thing to write a paper and make a declaration, but it's different to take action, because, even with the work that I've done, I could have sat there all day long for 5 years and wrote, things on Facebook and been a Facebook warrior, and, but that doesn't change the law.
Yeah.
That doesn't make changes in society, in the community. So.
Well, thank you so much. You've given us, both you and Leon have given us a lot to think about, and we are over time. So I'm going to kind of begin to wrap this up a bit. Thank you again for sharing your expertise and wisdom. May
I make just one more short comment?
Briefly.
Yes. Okay. So part of the colonial mindset and the colonial indoctrination is that we have to wait for the law to tell us what's right or wrong. And this is why I am complaining about why the church is in action and society's in action, is that they're waiting for the law to change when they can see the injustice right in front of them, and they're not responding to it except recognizing there's an injustice. So what I'm saying is not to scoff the law, but to do what you can with what you have in front of you that is an injustice. You need to act to do it, and not wait for somebody to approve of you to go ahead and do it. And there was an apology that was issued by the Methodist Church, by the way, but actually hasn't been issued yet, but it was concocted about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was presented to a district. The district approved it, said we apologize to the Hawaiians for the wrong that the church committed against the Hawaiian people. And then they sent it to be verified, or to be put onto the docket of the General Assembly, or whatever it's called. I can't remember what the body. Pardon me?
The
General Conference, yes, yes. And so, of course, it was supposed to be on the docket in 2020, but that was postponed to 2021. And then now that's been postponed to 2022. Meanwhile, the local churches that initiated it are waiting for permission or for this to pass General Conference before they actually implement any kind of acts of repentance for colonialism and for the church's role. And I'm thinking that this is really, it doesn't make sense. You know, if something is going on wrong right now, you actually act on it. You get your group together and you take an action. And that would be decolonizing. That would be an act of repentance. And that would be an act of repudiation of the doctrine of discovery.
Absolutely. So we don't have to wait for our laws to do the right thing.
Yes.
We are called to act with justice and mercy today
Yes.
in local churches and in our lives. We have heard a very clear call today from our speakers to go beyond declarations and statements that are not connected to action and accountability. So we have lots of work to do, friends. What are we going to do? How are we encouraging and continuing these conversations in our churches, in our communities? We have done several webinars. This is our third webinar on the Doctrine of Discovery. We have 2 more webinars coming up. And so I encourage you to continue to share the word and share these conversations. I invite Leon and Lorenda to share any books or links in the chat. I'll also reach out to them afterwards to see if there are any resources that we can also share, and maybe we can get a hold of that legislation, Leon, that we can share with folks as well. I know we weren't able to get to everyone's question today, but I want to make sure that we know about the next session, which is session 4, centering and othering, elevating white normativity, suppressing racial and indigenous identities. That will be on February 9th, 2022. Goodness, 2022 at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And I really encourage you to invite others to this conversation. Our webinar series occurs on the second Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern every other month. And you can find the link in the chat. I will share that where our previous recordings are and where this recording will be, and something easy for you to share with folks. And you'll also find information about the next UMKR and MFSA webinar that's coming up in January. Thank you all. We're going to have some informal time after our conversation, but thank you all, and I hope you all will hold on as we gather for this time.